Yeah, thank you very much, Kerstin, for this introduction. It's always quite interesting to hear what other people think what is most important in one's life. My speech will be about the legacy of Marx, and I will focus on the idea of utopias. In Europe in the 19th century, millions of people moved from the countryside to the emerging industrial cities like Manchester or Berlin. They were crammed into wretched living quarters. Despite heavy physical work in coal mines and textile mills, they could barely feed themselves by their wages, and at any time they could lose even this meagre livelihood in one of the seemingly inevitable economic crises. Child labor was not an exception, but the rule. It was Karl Marx who restored the dignity of these people, as according to his understanding of the course of history, they would have a historic mission, namely not only to redeem themselves out of misery, but at the same time to lead all humankind into a classless future. In their teleological view of history, which they adopted from Hegel, Marx and Engels conceived the capitalist mode of production both as a necessary phase of the development of humankind, as well as a mode of production which will necessarily perish. The collapse of capitalism was seen both as a result of its achievements and its contradictions. Thus, the proletarians, for the historical task of overcoming capitalism, would not require the inspirations by social utopias in the sense of, I quote, constructing a perfect social system based on some abstract principles, as the Russian Marxist Georgy Plekhanov later defined it. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels called utopias of this kind castles in the air. Workers would rather need the enlightenment about the course of history and their own historical destiny within it. This would be provided by the ideas of a socialism, which Marx has developed, as Engels called it, from its utopian to its scientific form. Nevertheless, Marx and Engels name some characteristics of a future society. In contrast to the voluntarism of which they accuse the so-called utopian socialists, however, they insist that these characteristics result scientifically predictable from the dissolution of the contradictions of historical class societies. According to Marx, in capitalism, because of the contradiction between social production and private appropriation, an enormous wealth of the society as a whole coincides with wasting and destruction of products and productive forces, especially in economic crisis. The misery of the working classes coexists with, as Engels put it, quote, the stupid extravagances of the now ruling classes. But as soon as the immense productive forces developed in capitalism would have been freed from the shackles of the capitalist production relations, the entire social product would substantially and sustainably exceed the necessary product. And then the principle, quote, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, could rule. At this stage of development, also the division of labor and its attached phenomena of alienation, and reification can be overcome as, quote, in communist society, nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes. This is what Marx wrote in the German ideology. A period of a free development of the individuals will begin both as a product and a prerequisite for the free development of all, as, quote, only in the community is personal freedom possible. These reflections obviously have the character of a utopia in the sense that they describe the perfection both of the individual and of the society as the end of historical processes as we know them. Thus, Marx and Engels here seem to formulate a secular eschatology similar to that known from the Jewish Christian tradition. There is, however, a difference both to the teleological religious thinking, which leads from the earthly vale of Tyr to paradise, as well as to the utopias in the political tradition reaching from Thomas More to Henri de Saint-Simon, which contrast a bright tomorrow with a gloomy today. The difference to both approaches lies in the claim of Marx and Engels to have found a really walkable way, namely class struggle, which can make the utopia become a reality. To quote Marx from his book on the Civil War in France, the fantastic utopias evanesced not because the working class had given up the end, but because they found the real means. Utopias in this sense are realistic alternatives, or, as the German Marxist Ernst Bloch called them, concrete, as they firstly refer to a change of society in accordance with natural and technical conditions and its own previous history. Concreteness of a utopia, secondly, requires the existence of a factor or an agent which, even if groping in the mist and surveying an unknown landscape, is in principle able to bring about this state of affairs. Thirdly, concreteness of a utopia requires the potential factor of change is willing to do so. This means that the conditions for the realization of a concrete utopia need to be provided both objectively and subjectively. In Marx's and Engels' arguments, these conditions are met by the existence of a class, that is, the proletariat, which, due to the contradictions of capitalism, is objectively interested in a fundamental change, as well as by the formation of their class consciousness in the interaction of theory and practice, which makes the proletariat become a revolutionary subject. Marx and Engels assert that the early socialists, with their abstract utopias, only want to turn the world upside down, while historical materialism provides the tools to put the wrong world with its injustices and its misery back on their feet, not by mere will, but by the execution of the historical task. According to Marx and Engels, the microcosms of individual ideas and small-scale social experiments, in the sense of, for instance, Robert Owen's New Lanark, are therefore to be replaced by the macrocosms of a limitless world of abundance and a delimitation of the possibilities of man. It has occasionally been criticized that at least the young Marx held a romantic image of a future society in which one hunts in the morning, fishes in the afternoon, and criticizes after dinner. Quote, I cannot agree with this objection. This is because I read this characterization as a cipher for the reconciliation of man with nature and thus also with its own nature. The future human being is a natural being who fits into nature and secures his biological existence out of nature. A kind of a post-capitalist Adam who resembles a Neolithic Adam, but at a higher level, and at the same time one who has the specific human ability of complex communication, and thus the human community is brought to its perfection. In this sense, a picture of the future of trans-temporal significance is painted. In the philosophical anthropology of Marx, as opposed to Robinson tales of liberalism, man is a dialectical entity seen as the self-determining zoon politikon whose individual freedom is the precondition for the freedom of all, and whose final stage of being in communion has no room left for alienation, reification, and exploitation. Marx's statements about the social formation following capitalism relating to the economic instruments, however, are to be seen in a different light. First, Marx, to my opinion, did not adequately reflect the ambivalence of the principle of the division of labor. Although he was completely in line with Adam Smith, aware of the fact that the division of labor was a main cause for productivity gains, he much more emphasized its negative consequence, which is alienation. It is paradox that Marx's post-capitalistic society needs an economy that is highly productive but deprives it on an essential basis, namely the possibility to produce a sufficiently large surplus as a result of the division of labor from the enterprise level to the international level. Moreover, there is the designation of two economic building blocks for a post-capitalist society, which inevitably follow from the analysis of capitalism as a negation of its basic systemic components. These building blocks are first socialization, which means the transformation of physical capital into simple means of producing things to satisfy human needs. And secondly, the coordination of production through state planning, rather than coordination of decentralized plans through market, as in capitalism. At the beginning of the 21st century, Marx's and Engels' expectations that capitalism will prevail worldwide have been confirmed. Marx and Engels foresee that what we call today globalization, or in the words of the Communist Manifesto, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. Of course, there is what can be called a proletariat in what is called the Global South, in a very similar position as people were in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. Millions of people move from the countryside to the sprawling metropoles like Dar es Salaam or Mumbai. They are crammed into wretched living quarters. Harsh working conditions prevail in places such as coltan mines in Congo and textile mills in China. Child labor exists in various industries around the Global South, especially in agriculture and some handicrafts. Thus, there exists what can be called a demand for a Marxian concrete utopia to inspire that struggle for emancipation. However, the attempt to realize the three elements of a non-capitalist economic system in technologically backward economies between 1917 and 1989, ending somewhat earlier in China, but still not quite finished in Cuba or North Korea, has led into economic catastrophes and discredited Marxism as an economic doctrine for post-capitalist formations. The withdrawal from the international division of labor was bought at a high price due to the lack of specialization advantages, as already pointed out by David Ricardo. The state ownership of means of production led to a behavior that Garrett Hardin has termed the tragedy of commons. And given the high complexity, even of technological-wise backward economies, I cannot help but accept the general critic of notorious anti-Marxist Friedrich August von Hayek that even supercomputers cannot predict the myriads of economic decisions of individuals which would be necessary for a centrally coordinated economy. Furthermore, Marxism had often been misunderstood in the newly independent countries in the southern hemisphere as a state-centered economic modernization strategy, quite contrary, by the way, to Marx and Engels' statement in the Russian preface to the Communist Manifesto of 1882 that the leapfrogging from pre-capitalist modes of production to post-capitalist modes of production is possible only in a world revolution perspective. On the other hand, Marx's inspiration had enabled the European labor movement in tough struggles with capital owners to achieve the 8-hour day, a tremendous increase in living standards and social security that we now take for granted in the economically highly developed welfare states. In the 19th century, working people were second-class citizens. In the 20th century, they became equal citizens in industrialized countries, and probably even that would not have been possible without the Marxist-inspired workers' movement. Not least, it is owed to this movement and its political representation that capitalism in Europe has been tamed. As a result of the construction of a welfare state, however, the workers' movement in highly industrialized countries has given up any connection to a radical alternative to global capitalism during the 20th century. Marx and Engels pointed out that no mode of production will perish before it has fully developed its potentials. They clearly saw the huge innovative power of capitalism. However, they did not foresee that capitalism had by far not yet exhausted its potentials 150 years after the publication of the Communist Manifesto. Presently, we are at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, and it is more than unclear whether at the end of this fourth industrial revolution a proletariat, in any sense we know, will still exist, or whether a new techno-economic paradigm will have emerged. If it is true that the country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed one the image of its own future, as Marx wrote in the preface to the Capital, then the utopias of the global south are more to be seen in a sort of welfare capitalism and post-industrial economic structure than in the 19th century inspired socialist utopias of Marx. But still, utopian ideas derived from Marx's philosophical anthropology can serve as the yardsticks to judge endeavors in favor of a humanization of work or economic justice by a fairer treatment of countries of the global south in the international framework. And what is more important, one can use the Marxian philosophical anthropology as a starting point to develop new utopias and get rid of already falsified hypotheses. As, to quote from the 18th Brumaire, quote, "The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." However, new practices already exist. Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, for instance, showed that collective property can function under certain conditions, and a tragedy of commons is not inevitable. Millions of people try new forms of cooperation all over the world. And also in science, we should not hesitate to think anew about present day's concrete utopias, even if that means to turn Marx's scientific socialism upside down, from feet to head again. Thank you very much.